In the bookshop I used to work in, we had a huge children's section. It ran in a great vibrant hemisphere from the horizon of Harry Potter on your left to the culmination of curriculum on your right. It was the habitat of great swathes of picture books, arcs of activity books, stacks of sticker books. It boasted the very finest of young classics and favoured read-alone chapter books. And of course, pride of place, bulging and threatening to overrun every additional bookshelf the moment it was awarded it, was a cutting-edge YA section. Poetry had a bay, a paltry collection that could clearly have been bundled onto a single shelf, but for the fact that someone had arranged them with the greatest of optimistic aesthetic. The poetry section of the children's world gives me some imaginings as to how an entire children's section might have looked some 200 years ago. There is, unarguably, some poetry for children. Edward Lear and Alan Alberg stand in glossy illustrated editions. They're the first, but then, unfortunately, the only step on from nursery rhyme. Poetry for children seems limited to babbling, nonsense, and, of course, the prime curse, rhyme and verse. Apart from a token Benjamin Zephaniah, the entire section doesn't really seem to recommend itself to anyone who's conquered the tender age of 11. The idea of the teenager has seemingly bypassed the poet. Poetry understands that very young children can't immediately settle down with the likes of Ginsberg and Keats, but it seems to demand that as soon as you've been weaned off the teddy bear, all black and brown and covered in hair, you start on adult poetry proper. Why is there no such thing as young adult poetry? Now, I know here people will try and retrospectively classify. Plath is surely suitable for teenagers. Anyone who's 15 must understand Armitage or Auden. But they're unarguably adult works, published into such a section and read, apart from in the classroom, largely by those legally robed in the dress of drinking and driver's licenses. Not written with a specifically young adult in mind. Retrospectively hailing the appropriateness of adult work for young adults can be done in poetry, as it can be done in novels and plays and films. But it doesn't mean those works were specifically crafted with young adult situations and experiences in mind. With regards to what is particularly important or enjoyable to people at young adult stages in life. Perhaps it's because in poetry, much more so than in prose, there is a huge disconnect between the literary and the popular. Because young adults are, arguably, actually consuming a great deal of poetry. It still smells as sweet, just under another name. A big part of young adult as a genre, differentiated firstly by publishers and booksellers, is that these should be books that this age group wants to read. It is finally understood that the aim of anyone teaching those in their formative years to read should be to engender a love of reading, so that books will continue on through their life as a whole and be there for them when they need them. YA as a category tries to do that. Books that you want to pick up and handle, books that pull you in, that grip you, that make you cry and catch your breath and burst out laughing. I guess as young adults at this age where we start to discover that the world is difficult and painful and transcends easy explanations, something that does this while also starting to show us that books have the introspective to help us cope. They begin to put the world into models of story and help us understand. Children's poetry seems to delight. Adult poetry seems to deal with these problems of self and understanding. There doesn't seem to be much middle ground, unless I consider music. Of course, the words of songs don't have to be listened to at all, but I remember seeking lyrics out, reading them, repeating them, rolling them round the recesses of my reason. They were beautiful, and they meant a huge amount to me. Lyric was for so long such an essential part of poetry. Now being spoken and being heard seems to only occasionally be remembered, tucked away into tidy little corners of slam. Literary works on the whole are read and confined to stanza. If popular pouts want, they can tawdry themselves up and flaunt about in strain. So young adult, in defining itself as a specific category, has not only forged itself in novels, but in poetry too, just requisitioning from rock and pop and all that jazz. Lyric is poetry and can be treated as such, exalted. And bring adult poetry, that traditional poetry, back down into something that can be interacted with by all. It needn't be feared as something just for the elite, something too complex and undecipherable. It has its difficulties, but they're to combat difficulties faced. And if we consider that there's an intermediary step, up from the babbling nonsense of children's poetry, through the gentle rise of young adult lyric, then it can be melodious. A glorious weapon, the sating of maladies, beauty distilled. So let's talk about reading it next time. How to read traditional adult poetry. Bye guys. What are you doing? Say hi. Ah.